Why did the silence after the firefight feel heavier than the explosions themselves? Sergeant Thomas Reed noticed it before anyone else. Not the ringing in his ears, not the drifting ash, the absence, a wrongness hanging in the air like breath held too long. He slowed his steps through the shattered outpost while the rest of the squad moved with practiced efficiency, weapons humming, boots crunching over glass stone. The mission had been simple. It was always simple on paper. Destroy the weapon's cache, neutralize resistance, leave nothing that could grow back. 73 years of war had reduced entire worlds to checklists. Move it, Commander clicked through the translator, his 4 eyes scanning thermal readouts. Transport in 10. Thomas nodded, though his attention drifted. Human eyes were cursed that way. They lingered, they questioned. They caught details that didn't fit cleanly into threat profiles. A bent beam, a collapsed ceiling, and beneath it, movement. Barely there, a flicker, a rise and fall too small to be structural shift. Contact, rear position, Thomas said, already stepping closer. His plasma rifle lifted instantly, targeting reticle locked. No hesitation. The war had burned that out of them long ago. Stand down, Thomas said, sharper now. Confusion rippled through the comms. Turned. Reed, move aside. Thomas crouched. Dust coated his gloves as he pushed aside debris, revealing a small, broken form curled into itself. Gray scales dulled by ash. Limbs too thin. Chest shuddering with shallow, uneven breaths. A cub. No more than 5 or 6 by human measure. It said, future soldier. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. A familiar ache he'd learned to bury under years of orders and aftermath reports. It's a child. Protocol. Protocol doesn't breathe like this, Thomas snapped. He knelt fully now, hands gentle despite the blood caked beneath his nails. 3 ribs broken. Dehydration. Lacerations that should have killed him days ago. Somehow, the cub had survived the bombardment, the collapse, the firestorm that followed. And now, the war wanted to finish the job. I'm taking him with us. The words landed like a dropped weapon. His voice lowered. You understand what you're saying. I understand what I'm doing. You will face tribunal. Thomas lifted the cub into his arms. The small body was light, too light. The child whimpered, weak, eyes unfocused, but didn't fight, didn't snarl, just clutched at Thomas's uniform as if instinct knew this was the only solid thing left in the universe. Yeah, Thomas said quietly, I know. As they walked back to the ship, the squad said nothing. The cub's breathing filled the silence, labored and fragile. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the weight in his arms. Because for the first time in years, Thomas felt afraid, not of death, but of being seen. Why does mercy feel like a crime when the world is built on survival? The medical bay doors didn't open. Authorization, treating enemy combatants was one thing. Bringing one aboard by choice was another entirely. Regulations stacked against him like a wall. So Thomas turned away. He carried the cub to his quarters and locked the door. For 7 days, while the tribunal assembled their case, Thomas became something he hadn't been since before the war. A caretaker. He cleaned wounds with hands that had ended hundreds of lives. Crushed nutrient paste into something soft enough to swallow. Sat through long nights as fever took hold and the cub cried out in a language Thomas didn't understand, but didn't need to. Fear sounded the same everywhere. By the 3rd day, the cub could sit up. By the 5th, he could eat solid food. By the 7th, pink scars traced where open wounds had been. Thomas started calling him Kid in his mind, short for nothing, a name that asked for nothing. At night, when the ship hummed and tribunal notifications blinked unanswered, Thomas sat on the floor and watched Kit sleep, and wondered when he'd stopped believing this mattered. The morning of the tribunal, Thomas dressed in formal uniform, smoothed the creases, cleaned Kit's with care. Whatever happened next, he wanted the truth to be visible. The alarm screamed before he reached the door. Battle stations. He rushed to the viewport. The horizon was black with ships, hundreds and armada. Kit pressed against his leg, trembling. The quantum spear was a frigate, not a miracle. They would be gone in minutes. But the ships didn't fire. A single craft detached, white plasma field, Parley. "They're requesting Sergeant Reed," announced, disbelief cracking through his composure, offering an exchange. Thomas looked down. Kit's eyes were wide, not with fear. With recognition. What does vengeance do when it meets a living answer? The docking bay was silent as the chieftains emerged, massive, predators shaped by war. The female saw Kit and broke. The sound tore through every translator, raw and ancient. Kit ran. The reunion was desperate, claws searching for injuries that no longer existed, tears from eyes that had ordered worlds burned. Then she turned to Thomas and knelt. "We came for war," she said, "dead or alive, but he lives." Her voice shook. "You were his enemy, yet you chose him." She stood, voice carrying. "This war ends today." The bay held its breath. "We will remember that humanity is not a species. It is a choice." 6 months later, Thomas stood in a peace garden on Prime. Kit laughed among human children. The tribunal had dissolved. The war was over. Thomas felt lighter, not proud, not heroic. Just whole. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the universe wait until the war was ending to finally ask him what it had taken from him? Thomas didn't answer the question right away. It surfaced later, quietly, the way truth often does, when the noise is gone and there's nothing left to distract you from your own thoughts. In the hours after the docking bay emptied, after the armada without firing a single shot, after Kit was escorted, gently, back to his parents, Thomas was alone for the first time in days. Too alone. His quarters felt wrong, too clean, too quiet. The small pallet on the floor where Kit had slept was still there, folded neatly like a ghost pretending it might return. Thomas stood in the doorway longer than necessary, unsure whether to step inside or walk away. He felt foolish for the hesitation. He had faced orbital bombardments without flinching. Yet this absence pressed against his ribs like something unfinished. He sat on the edge of his bunk and finally let his hands shake. He hadn't planned on saving anyone that day. That was the truth he hadn't said out loud. It wasn't some grand rebellion against the war or a carefully weighed moral stand. He had just seen a child where the war demanded an enemy. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The comm panel chimed. Sergeant Reed said, his voice different now, slower, less sharp. "You are relieved of tribunal pending further notice." Thomas almost laughed, almost, and added, after a pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, "Thank you for disobeying me." The channel closed. Thomas leaned back and stared at the ceiling as the ship slipped into quiet orbit. Relief came, but it didn't bring peace. Not yet. Relief only made space for everything else he'd been holding down. The fear, the doubt, the quiet question of whether one merciful act could possibly balance decades of violence. He thought of Kit's small claws gripping his sleeve, of the way the cub had flinched at sudden sounds, even days after the danger passed. Trauma didn't vanish just because wounds healed. Thomas knew that better than anyone. He slept poorly that night. Dreams dragged him back to other outposts, other bodies, other moments where he hadn't stepped between the weapon and the target, faces blurred together, adult, child, enemy, ally. The labels dissolved until all that remained were eyes asking a question he hadn't known how to answer then. Why not me? He woke before ship cycle dawn, breath shallow, heart racing. Old instincts, old scars. He sat up and forced himself to breathe through it, grounding himself in the hum of the ship, the steady pulse of systems that hadn't failed. Someone knocked. Thomas stiffened. No one knocked anymore. Not in the military. Not after years of everyone learning it was easier to keep distance from humans who survived too long. When he opened the door, a junior officer stood there, visibly nervous. "Sir, the delegation has requested to see you again, privately." Thomas felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten. He nodded anyway. The conference chamber was dim, lit low to accommodate vision. The chieftain mother stood as he entered. She didn't wear armor now, just ceremonial wraps marked with symbols Thomas didn't understand but somehow felt. "You are afraid," she said plainly. Thomas didn't deny it. "So are you." Her eyes softened. "Yes." They sat across from each other, not as enemies, not as symbols, just two beings shaped by loss. She spoke first, voice steady but heavy. "For 73 cycles, we taught our children that mercy was weakness. That hesitation meant extinction. My son learned that lesson before he learned his own name." Thomas swallowed. "He was with a patrol," she continued. "Too young. But we told ourselves war does not wait for maturity. When the outpost fell, we assumed," her claws curled inward, "we assumed the universe had taken its due." "And if he had died," Thomas asked quietly, "what would you have done?" She met his gaze. "What we have always done. Burned, destroyed, called it justice." Silence stretched between them. "You broke the loop," she said at last. "Not by force, by refusal." Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not pride, something heavier, responsibility. "I didn't do it for peace," he admitted. "I did it because I couldn't watch another child die." The chieftain inclined her head. "That is why it worked." Before she left, she placed a small object on the table. A talisman, worn smooth by generations. "For when you forget," she said, "because you will." She was right. For the next weeks the galaxy moved faster than Thomas could process. Prisoners were exchanged. Ceasefire lines dissolved. Negotiations began, clumsy and cautious. Everyone wanted statements, interviews, symbols. Thomas avoided them all. He watched from observation decks as former enemies docked side by side. He listened as officers debated new protocols, new language. Words like dignity and restraint entered official reports for the first time in decades. But at night alone, the old weight crept back in. He wondered about the soldiers who wouldn't come home, about the orders he'd followed without question, about whether mercy offered too late was still mercy, or just regret dressed up as wisdom. One evening, as he stared out at it that no longer felt hostile, a small voice spoke behind him. "Thomas." He turned. Kit stood there, flanked by two guards who kept a respectful distance. The cub walked more steadily now, taller, eyes clearer. "I wanted to say goodbye," Kit said, choosing the words carefully. "Mother says I must learn many things now." Thomas knelt, meeting him at eye level. The familiar ache returned, sharp and sudden. "You're going to be okay," Thomas said. "It wasn't a promise, just hope." Kit reached out and pressed the talisman back into Thomas's hand. "You keep it," he said, "so you remember too." Thomas closed his fingers around it. As Kit walked away, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe the universe wasn't asking what it had taken from him. Maybe it was asking what he was willing to give back. What do you do when the war ends, but the soldier inside you doesn't know how to stop standing guard? Thomas learned the answer slowly, painfully, in fragments that arrived without warning. Peace didn't come with a ceremony for him. It arrived in empty hours, in mornings without orders, in nights where the silence pressed closer than any battlefield ever had. The quantum spear returned to Union space under banners of ceasefire, and for the first time in Thomas Reed's career, no one told him where to stand or who to aim at. He was given leave. Mandatory, they called it, as if rest could be enforced like discipline. The station they sent him to orbited a pale blue world that had never seen war directly, only its echoes. Refugees passed through in waves. Former prisoners. Displaced families from both sides, carrying what little could survive evacuation. Thomas watched them from a distance at first, leaning against observation rails, hands clasped behind his back like he was still on duty. He told himself he was just observing. But really he was afraid. Afraid that without the structure of conflict, everything he'd buried would surface. Afraid that the part of him that knew how to pull a trigger faster than a thought would have nowhere to go. Afraid that mercy, once chosen, would demand more of him than he had left to give. A counselor tried to speak with him on the third day. "You don't have to be strong here," she said gently. Thomas nodded, said nothing. Strength had nothing to do with it. He simply didn't know how to be anything else. It was a child who broke the stalemate. A human girl, maybe 7, dropped a ration pack in the corridor and froze when it burst open. The sound echoed, sharp, too much like a weapon discharge. She stared at the scattered food, eyes filling, shoulders curling inward as if she expected punishment for gravity itself. Thomas reacted without thinking. He knelt slowly, let his movements be visible, non-threatening. "It's okay," he said, voice low. "Happens to everyone." The girl studied him, distrust battling exhaustion. Finally, she nodded. As they gathered the food, Thomas felt something loosen. Not the past, just the present. After that, he began helping. Quietly, carrying supplies, sitting with those who couldn't sleep, translating when voices trembled too much to speak clearly. He never wore his uniform, never told stories. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to be useful, in a way that didn't involve survival math. One evening, he noticed a familiar posture across the mess hall. An adolescent sat alone, tail wrapped tight, eyes tracking every movement. Food untouched. Guards nearby, nervous but restrained. Thomas hesitated. Old instincts screamed caution. Old memories whispered consequences. But another image overlaid them, Kit's small claws gripping his sleeve. Thomas picked up a tray and approached. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, using the universal trade dialect. The adolescent didn't answer, didn't move, but didn't bare teeth either. They ate in silence. Minutes passed, then the spoke, voice rough. "My clutch brother died in the war." Thomas nodded. "I'm sorry." "You fought us," the said. "Yes." "You saved one of us." "Yes." The adolescent looked at him, confused. "Why?" Thomas stared at his food, suddenly unsure. He had answered this question before, but it felt different now, less dramatic, more personal. "Because someone once saved me," he said, "and I didn't understand it either." That wasn't entirely true, or maybe it was. Memory blurred. A medic on a burning moon, a hand pulling him from wreckage, a voice saying stay with me when it would have been easier not to. They nodded slowly, not in agreement, in processing. That night Thomas dreamed differently. No explosions, no alarms, just long corridors and doors he didn't open, and when he woke he realized something had changed. The war inside him wasn't gone, but it was listening. Weeks turned into months. The union offered Thomas commendations. He declined. Offered promotions. He declined those too. Rank felt irrelevant now. He accepted only one thing, a transfer request to a joint humanitarian unit forming under the new accords. Some called it. Others called it dangerous. Thomas called it necessary. The first mission was small, escorting medical supplies to a border world where trust was still thin and tempers thinner. Mixed teams, human, species that had once only met through gunfire. On the shuttle, tension was thick. Hands hovered too close to weapons that weren't supposed to be used. Thomas sat between them. Not because he was in charge. Because he understood what it meant to be afraid of peace. When they landed, a crowd waited, not cheering, watching, measuring. A stone flew, then another. Thomas stepped forward before anyone else could. He raised his empty hands. No speech, no orders. Just presence. The stone stopped. Later, as medical tents went up and children peeked from doorways, a medic stood beside him. "You are tired," she said. "Yes." "But you are still here." "Yes." She studied him. "That is strength." Thomas thought of the years he'd equated strength with endurance, with silence, with obedience. This felt different. That night, under an unfamiliar sky, he looked up at the stars and felt something close to pride, not in what he'd done in the war, but in what he hadn't done since. He still woke with tension in his shoulders, still scanned rooms, still counted exits. But now, when fear rose, it didn't automatically become anger. Sometimes it became patience. And sometimes, quietly, it became purpose. Not the kind that demands sacrifice for banners or borders. The kind that asks you to stay, to sit, to see, and to choose again and again, not who deserves mercy, but who needs it. The war had taken much from Thomas Reed. But for the first time, it wasn't the one deciding what he would give next. What happens when doing the right thing stops feeling brave and starts feeling unbearably heavy? Thomas discovered the answer on a rain-soaked border world, whose name no one bothered to pronounce correctly anymore. It had once been a supply hub, then a battlefield. Now it was a place where ruins learned how to exist alongside hope. The Joint Humanitarian Unit had been there 3 weeks, longer than planned. Delays stacked up, paperwork stalled, old grudges resurfaced in new forms. Peace, Thomas was learning, didn't explode, it eroded. Slowly, relentlessly. The days blurred together. He woke before dawn, checked manifests, walked the perimeter, mediated arguments that flared over nothing and everything. He spoke softly, listened more than he talked, and at night, when exhaustion pressed behind his eyes, he lay awake wondering how many people expected him to be something he was. A symbol. He hated that part most. Because symbols didn't bleed. Symbols didn't doubt themselves at 3 in the morning. Symbols didn't wonder if one bad decision would undo everything that had been built so carefully, so quietly. The breaking point came without warning. A supply convoy failed to arrive. At first it was chalked up to a navigation error, then a comms blackout, then rumors, old ones, recycled and sharpened, whispers of betrayal, of militants who hadn't accepted the ceasefire, of humans looking for an excuse to reclaim lost ground. The camp grew tense. Hands drifted back toward weapons. Old reflexes reawakened like scars itching before a storm. Thomas felt it too. That was what frightened him most. He stood in the command tent staring at a holomap when the alert came in. A skirmish. Small, they said. Contained. By the time Thomas arrived, it was. 2 bodies lay in the mud. One human. One both young. Both dead for reasons no one could clearly explain. Around them, shouting rose, voices overlapping, accusations flying faster than facts. Thomas pushed through the crowd, heart pounding. This was how it started. This was how it always started. He knelt beside the bodies, ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. He didn't touch them, just looked, really looked, saw fear frozen into faces that should have had decades left. A human officer grabbed his arm. "We need to secure the perimeter before this spreads." An elder hissed in response, "Your kind fired first." Thomas stood slowly. Every eye turned to him. The symbol they wanted, the answer they needed. He felt the weight crush down on his chest, heavier than any pack he'd carried in the war. If he spoke wrong now, people would die. He took a breath, then another. "No one moves," he said, not loudly but with a calm that cut through the noise. "Not until we understand what happened." "They're already dead," someone shouted. "Yes," Thomas said, And if we rush, there will be more. Silence crept in, uneasy but real. They investigated together, human, and it took hours. Arguments flared, accusations resurfaced, but slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. A third party, smugglers, profiteers feeding on instability, armed with stolen tech, eager to ignite old hatreds for new gain. The convoy had been ambushed, the skirmish staged to look like betrayal. When it finally became clear, the anger didn't vanish, but it redirected. Thomas sank onto a crate, exhaustion crashing through him. A medic approached. "You could have ordered force," she said. "You did not." "I wanted to," Thomas admitted. The honesty surprised him. For a moment, it felt easier. She studied him. Easier is rarely better. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The images replayed. The dead, the shouting, the knife-edge moment where everything could have collapsed. He wondered how many more times he could stand in that space, between fear and fury, without something inside him breaking. He thought of Kid. Not the cub running through gardens, but the trembling child beneath rubble. The version of Kit who hadn't known whether the next being he saw would end his life or spare it. Thomas pressed his palms together, grounding himself. Peace wasn't a single choice. It was a series of them, and each one demanded something different. The next day, he volunteered to escort the recovered convoy route personally, not as protection, as presence. It was dangerous, everyone knew it. "You don't have to keep proving anything," a fellow officer told him. Thomas shook his head. "I'm not proving, I'm practicing." The road was long, quiet, the kind of quiet that made you listen to your own thoughts whether you wanted to or not. He rode in the open, visible, unarmored. If someone wanted to make a statement, he would be an easy one. But no one attacked. Villagers emerged cautiously as the convoy passed, watched, some waved, some didn't. Trust didn't arrive all at once, it trickled. At a checkpoint near dusk, a young guard hesitated, then lowered his weapon. Thomas met his gaze and nodded, nothing more. That night, as the convoy rolled safely into camp, Thomas felt the exhaustion deepen, but beneath it, something steadier formed. Not confidence. Commitment. He understood now that this work would never make him famous, never make him clean. It would ask him to absorb tension, to be misunderstood, to stand in the gap when others pulled away. And some days, it would hurt more than the war ever had. But as he watched children, human, and share food by lantern light, Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle in his bones. Strength wasn't about how much violence you could endure. It was about how much responsibility you were willing to carry without letting it harden you. Peace didn't need heroes. It needed people stubborn enough to keep choosing it, even when it stopped feeling like victory and started feeling like work. What if the hardest part of redemption isn't what you've done, but how long you have to live with remembering it? The question came to Thomas on a night when nothing went wrong. No alarms, no arguments, no shadows moving where they shouldn't. The camp slept under a thin veil of stars, and the world felt, for once, almost gentle. That was when it hit him. The quiet, the kind that doesn't soothe, only exposes. He sat alone near the perimeter, boots planted in the dust, turning the talisman over in his hands. The surface was worn smooth now, not just by generations of, but by his own thumb tracing the same groove again and again. He had carried it through border skirmishes and negotiations, through moments where anger rose so fast it scared him. It had become an anchor. But anchors only matter because something inside you is still drifting. A message arrived on his slate just after midnight. Union command. Not a request. A summons. Thomas read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't change, but the meaning settled deeper each time. A formal inquiry, historical accountability review. His name was listed not as a hero, but as a witness. The war was ending officially now. That meant records were being opened, decisions revisited, actions measured by standards that hadn't existed when the orders were given. And Thomas Reed was very good at remembering. He traveled alone to the review station, a neutral structure suspended between territories like a question mark no one wanted to answer. The halls were white, too white, designed to feel impartial, designed to make everything echo. In the waiting chamber, Thomas sat across from holograms of people who had never smelled smoke on their skin. They spoke carefully, precisely. "Sergeant Reed," one of them began, "you are not on trial." Thomas nodded. He didn't trust that sentence. They asked him about missions, about outposts, about civilian casualty estimates and operational necessity. They asked him about orders he had followed, orders he had questioned, and the one he had finally refused. They asked him about the child. Each answer took something out of him. Not because he was ashamed, but because memory is a form of reliving, and some moments are heavy no matter how much time has passed. At one point an official paused. "Do you believe," she asked, "that your actions undermine the war effort?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said. A murmur rippled through the chamber. "And do you regret that?" "No." Silence followed, not hostile, not approving. Just real. When the inquiry ended, no verdict was announced, no judgment rendered. They thanked him for his candor, said history would decide what records could not. Thomas left feeling strangely hollow. Back at the camp, things had changed in his absence. Subtly. There were fewer guards at the perimeter, more shared patrols. A child waved at him as he passed, then laughed as if surprised by his own courage. Thomas smiled despite himself. Later that evening, he was called to the infirmary. A woman lay on the bed, weak, scales dulled by illness. Beside her stood a human doctor, frustration etched deep into her face. "We're out of compatible plasma expanders," the doctor said. "We can stabilize her for hours, maybe, but not long enough." Thomas understood before she finished. Biology was incompatible with most Union supplies, except in rare cases. "Humans." "I'll do it," Thomas said. The doctor hesitated. "You're not cleared." "I'm compatible," Thomas replied, "and I consent." The woman's eyes fluttered open. She focused on him with effort. "You are tired," she whispered. Thomas smiled faintly. "So are you." The transfer was slow, draining. He felt the familiar dizziness creep in, the edges of the world softening. The doctor monitored vitals closely, ready to stop if needed. As the plasma flowed, Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. This wasn't heroism. It wasn't sacrifice in the dramatic sense. It was practical, necessary, quiet. When it was over, he sat slumped in a chair, weak but steady. The woman lived. Later, as he recovered, Kit sent a message, short, simple, a recording. "I am learning," Kit said. "I help the smaller ones now, like you helped me." Thomas closed his eyes. The war hadn't erased what he'd done. Nothing ever would. But redemption, he was learning, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it be the final word. Somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, Thomas realized something else too. He wasn't carrying the war alone anymore. The burden had begun to spread, not as blame, but as responsibility shared across species, across choices. And for the first time, that weight felt lighter. Not because it was gone, but because it was being used for something that mattered. What does a life become when it's no longer measured by what you destroy, but by what you leave standing? Thomas asked himself that question on Prime, standing at the edge of the Peace Garden as morning light filtered through crystalline growths that sang softly when the wind passed through them. He had heard the sound before on recordings, but in person it was different. Alive, imperfect, real. Children ran between the structures, human, and others still learning how to share the same space without fear. Their laughter overlapped, messy and uncoordinated. No one tried to organize it. No one needed to. Thomas stood slightly apart, hands folded behind his back out of habit. He still looked like a soldier, even without the uniform. Some things didn't leave you just because the war did. Kit spotted him first. He was taller now, stronger. His movements carried confidence instead of caution. When he ran, it wasn't away from danger, but towards something. "Thomas," Kit called, voice clear. No translator needed this time. Thomas knelt as the the child, reached him. Kit wrapped his arms around Thomas's shoulders with surprising strength. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that simple contact. "You came," Kit said. "I said I would." Kit pulled back, studying him with eyes that saw more than they used to. "Mother says you do not have to anymore." Thomas smiled softly. "Maybe, but I wanted to." The ceremony was small by galactic standards. No fleets. No speeches carved into history crystals. Just representatives standing together, marking something fragile they all agreed to protect. Peace didn't need spectacle. It needed witnesses. When the chieftain spoke, her voice carried without amplification. "We once believed survival required us to harden ourselves against compassion. We were wrong." She paused, gaze sweeping the gathered crowd. "Strength did not save us. Fear did not save us. A choice did." Her eyes found Thomas, not as a symbol, as a person. Later, after the crowd dispersed and the garden settled into quiet, Thomas sat on a stone bench and let himself feel it all. The weight, the relief, the sadness that still lived alongside the hope. He thought of the soldiers who never made it here, of the moments he would carry forever, of the fact that peace hadn't erased his scars, but had given them meaning. A union representative approached him. "They're rewriting the protocols," she said. "First contact, engagement rules, humanitarian overrides." Thomas nodded. "Good. They want your input." He considered that. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, his value had been measured in obedience. Now it was being measured in judgment. "I'll help," he said, "as long as we remember one thing." She waited. "That rules don't make us humane," Thomas said. "People do." That evening, as stars emerged over Prime, Thomas walked the garden paths alone. The talisman rested in his pocket, warm from his hand. He no longer needed to touch it constantly. The lesson it carried had settled deeper now. He stopped near a young tree planted to mark the end of the war. Its roots were shallow still, vulnerable but growing. Thomas placed his palm against the soil. He understood something then, with a clarity that didn't demand words. Humanity was never about perfection, or innocence, or the absence of violence. It was about what you did after you understood the cost. It was about standing in the space between fear and choice, and choosing anyway. Not loudly, not proudly, but deliberately. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout its presence. It simply acts. And in doing so, it reminds the universe, quietly, stubbornly, that even after the darkest wars, some lights are worth protecting. Especially the small ones. Especially when no one is watching. What happens after the story ends, when no one is watching anymore? Thomas stayed on Prime longer than anyone expected, longer than the officials, longer than the storytellers who preferred clean endings and clear departures. Life, he had learned, rarely wrapped itself up that neatly. The peace garden grew slowly. Some plants failed. Some thrived in unexpected ways. The crystalline growth sang differently as seasons shifted, their tones changing with the air, reminding everyone that harmony wasn't static, it was responsive. It listened. It adapted. So did Thomas. He took a modest role in the new Joint Council. Not a commander, not a representative of humanity's pride, just a voice when one was needed. Often he said very little. He had discovered that silence, used carefully, could invite others to speak more honestly. There were setbacks. Arguments flared, old wounds reopened, a border incident here, a misunderstanding there. Peace was not a straight line, it was a series of corrections. Each one required patience. Each one tempted people to fall back into what they knew best. Fear was efficient. Thomas still felt it sometimes. A tightening in his chest when raised voices echoed too sharply. A flicker of readiness when sudden movement cut across his vision. The war had trained his body well. It would never fully forget. But now, when fear arrived, it didn't take control. He acknowledged it, let it pass. That, he realized, was the difference. One afternoon, Kit sat beside him on a low wall overlooking the garden. Older now, curious, thoughtful. "Do you ever wish," Kit asked carefully, "that you had never found me?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the children playing below, saw a human girl trip a boy help her up. Small moments, ordinary moments, the kind that once would have seemed impossible. "No," Thomas said at last, "but I do wish the universe hadn't given me so many chances to learn the same lesson." Kit tilted his head. "Why does it keep doing that?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Because learning it once isn't enough." As the years passed, Thomas found himself stepping back more often, letting others lead, trusting that the values taking root didn't need him standing guard forever. That was harder than any battlefield had ever been. Letting go always is. On his final day as an active council member, there was no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement, a few nods, a shared understanding that this, too, was part of peace, knowing when to step aside. Thomas packed lightly. Before leaving, he walked the garden one last time, stopped at the tree planted to mark the end of the war. Its trunk was thicker now, its roots deep enough to survive storms. He pressed his palm to the bark. "I won't forget," he murmured, not as a vow, as a truth. As his shuttle lifted into the sky, Prime shrinking beneath him, Thomas felt no surge of triumph, no swell of legacy. Just gratitude. For the child who had reminded him what mattered. For the enemies who had chosen to become something more. For the quiet moments where fear had been met with restraint instead of violence. The universe would face wars again, he knew that. Stories like his didn't end conflict forever. They didn't fix everything. But they left markers. Proof that another way had existed once and could exist again. Thomas Reed was not remembered as a hero in most official records. He was listed as a footnote, an anomaly, a man who broke protocol at the wrong moment and somehow made it the right one. And that was enough. Because in the end, humanity was never about dominance or perfection or victory written in history. It was about the choices made when no one is cheering. The restraint shown when anger feels justified. The courage to see a life, small, fragile, inconvenient, and decide it matters. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't demand attention or carve its name into monuments. It simply acts. And in doing so, it quietly changes the shape of the future.